The morning Louise Bancroft buried her last hope alongside her husband's grave, she told herself she would never ask another living soul for anything again. And for 3 years she had kept that promise with a stubbornness that impressed even the hardiest souls in Redemption Creek, Texas, in the autumn of 1878. The town of Redemption Creek sat at the edge of the Texas hill country like something God had sketched and then thought better of finishing. There were two saloons, a general store run by a man named Harold Pitts who charged too much for flour and felt justified about it, a church whose roof leaked every spring, and a scattering of homesteads that pushed out from the main street like the spokes of a wheel that had seen better days. The land was beautiful in the way that dangerous things often are, all copper-colored rock and cedar thickets, and a creek that ran silver in the morning light before it narrowed to a trickle by August. People came to Redemption Creek because they were running toward something or away from something, and sometimes it was hard to tell the difference. Louise had come with her husband, Daniel Bancroft, 6 years prior. They had traveled down from Missouri with a wagon loaded with hope and a modest inheritance from Daniel's uncle, enough to stake a claim on 40 acres and build something that might, in a generous decade, become a real working cattle ranch. Daniel had been a good man. Not a perfect man, not a man who could read the sky for weather the way some of the old-timers could, not a man who had ever quite figured out how to fix the south fence before it became a catastrophe rather than an inconvenience, but good. Gentle with animals and children, and with Louise in the particular way that matters most, the way that makes a person feel that their presence in a room improves the room. He had died of a fever in the spring of 1875, 3 years into their project, when their daughter Millie was barely 2 years old, and the ranch was still more aspiration than achievement. The fever came fast and left faster, and it left Louise alone with 40 acres, a child, 12 head of cattle, a horse named Copper who was getting on in years, and a mortgage held by the Cattlemen's Bank of San Antonio that did not care one whit about the grief of widows. 3 years. 3 years of getting up before dawn and working, until the dark made it impossible to see what she was doing, of patching fences herself and learning to fix the pump herself, and negotiating at the market in town, with the kind of quiet iron in her voice that made men back away slowly as if they had stumbled into something they hadn't anticipated. She hired day labor when she could afford it, which was not often, and she got by. That was the most honest word for it. She got by. Her neighbor to the east was a man named Old Cutter, who was 60-something and had the disposition of a cactus, and her neighbor to the north was the Parson family, who were nice enough but had 6 children of their own and could not be expected to carry anyone else's burdens. The women of the town had been kind to her in the beginning, bringing casseroles and offering to watch Millie, but kindness in a hard land has a natural shelf life, and eventually everyone had to return to their own troubles. Louise understood this. She did not resent it. She had simply adjusted her understanding of the world to account for the reality that she was, in all the ways that mattered practically, alone. She had Millie, who was now 5 years old and possessed of her father's gentle eyes and her mother's determination, and she had the land, and she had her own 2 hands, and she had told herself that this was enough, and had nearly convinced herself it was true. The day Isaac Fletcher rode into Redemption Creek was the 1st of October, 1878, and the air had just begun to carry that particular edge that meant the real cold was thinking about arriving. Louise was at the general store when he came in, and she registered him the way a person registers weather, as something that might affect her day but was probably not her concern. He was tall, perhaps 30 or 31, with the kind of lean build that comes from years of physical work rather than the kind that comes from not eating enough, and he had dark hair that was dusty from the road and eyes that were a complicated shade between brown and green that Louise would have trouble describing accurately later if she had tried. He wore a good hat and working clothes and carried himself without the swagger that she had learned to be wary of in men who came through cattle country thinking they had something to prove. He bought provisions: flour, coffee, salt pork, a new length of rope. He made conversation with Harold Pitts with the ease of someone who was genuinely interested in people rather than performing interest for social reasons. He did not look at Louise with any particular agenda, which she noticed precisely because most men who came through did. She gathered her own purchases: sugar, a bolt of calico she had been saving for, lamp oil, paid for them, and left without speaking to him. She thought nothing more of it. She was wrong to think nothing more of it, but she did not know that yet. It was 2 days later when Isaac Fletcher appeared at the edge of her property, walking along the south fence line with the focused attention of a man studying something he is trying to understand. Louise saw him from the window while she was making breakfast and felt the particular bristle that comes from years of having to be vigilant about her land, her rights, her position as a woman alone in a place where those things were not always respected. She went outside. Millie was still sleeping, which meant she had perhaps 15 minutes before the small person who governed much of her morning would require attention. "That fence line is mine," Louise said as she approached him. She did not shout it. She did not need to. Isaac turned, and he had the grace not to look startled, which she appreciated despite herself. He pulled his hat from his head, which was the kind of automatic respect that comes from genuine upbringing rather than strategic display. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I could see that. I was noticing the posts." "What about them?" "3 of them are rotted through at the base," he said. "The wire is holding by faith more than physics at this point. One good north wind and you'll have cattle on the road." Louise looked at the fence. She knew about the posts. She had known about the posts for 6 weeks and had been calculating whether she could afford new lumber before the rains, and also fix the roof over the barn before the rains, and also have enough left for feed through the winter. And the mathematics of those calculations had not yet resolved themselves into anything comfortable. "I'm aware of the fence," she said. "I have no doubt of that," he said. He looked at her with those complicated eyes, and there was no condescension in them, which continued to disarm her in ways she did not welcome. "I'm Isaac Fletcher. I've taken the old Harmon place." The old Harmon place. That was the 40-acre parcel that backed up to the southwest corner of her land, separated from her by a draw and a stand of live oaks that turned gold in October. Bill Harmon had given up on it 2 years ago and gone back to Tennessee, and the land had sat empty since, slowly going feral, which was the natural fate of unattended land in Texas. Louise had sometimes wondered if someone would eventually take it up again. "Louise Bancroft," she said. "I know," he said. "Harold Pitts told me about you. He said you run this place by yourself and that you are, quote, entirely formidable about it." She did not smile, but the effort it took was slightly more than usual. Harold Pitts should concern himself with his own business. "He didn't say it as a criticism," Isaac said. He turned back to look at the fence. "I was thinking, since I'm setting my own fence line this week and I'll have the equipment out anyway, I could come fix those 3 posts for you. Wouldn't take more than a morning." Louise looked at him. She had a very specific and well-practiced response to offers of help, which was a polite refusal delivered in a tone that made it clear the refusal was final. The response was ready and formed, and she opened her mouth to deliver it. "I would pay you for the materials and your time," she said instead, and was almost surprised by her own words. Isaac looked equally surprised, but he covered it quickly. "The materials won't cost much, and the time, call it a neighborly gesture." "I don't accept charity," Louise said, and the words came out with more edge than she intended. "I'm not offering charity," he said, matching her tone not with hardness but with a kind of quiet steadiness. "I'm offering to fix 3 fence posts because they need fixing and I'll have the tools out anyway. If it makes you more comfortable, you could feed me dinner when I'm done." She studied him for a long moment. The morning was cool and bright, and there was a jay making a considerable noise in the cedar behind the house. She was calculating the way she always calculated, measuring costs against benefits, measuring the risk of accepting against the risk of declining. The fence posts needed to be done before the cold set in. That was a fact. "Thursday," she said. "Come Thursday if you're going to come." "Thursday it is," Isaac said. He put his hat back on and nodded to her, and walked back toward the draw and the live oaks without another word. And Louise stood at her fence line watching him go and feeling unsettled in a way she could not immediately categorize. She told herself it was just the disruption of routine. She was not entirely wrong, but she was not entirely right either. Thursday came with a cold blue sky and wind from the north that rattled the kitchen window and made Millie announce at breakfast that winter was absolutely definitely coming right this minute, Mama. Louise had made extra biscuits and had a pot of beans going on the stove that had been simmering since the night before, and she told herself that this was simply prudent hospitality toward a neighbor and nothing more involved than that. Isaac arrived at 8 in the morning with a wagon loaded with cedar posts, a post-hole digger, wire, and a young man from town named Peter who worked odd jobs and had the cheerful and uncomplicated disposition of someone who had not yet been disappointed by enough things to have developed complexity. They set to work on the fence with a brisk efficiency that Louise watched from the corner of her eye while she repaired tack in the barn. Millie, who had no protocol regarding strangers and no interest in developing one, went directly to the fence line and installed herself as an audience within 20 minutes. Louise could hear her asking questions at a rate that would have exhausted most adults, and she waited for the sound of polite evasion or the particular strained patience that adults usually employed with persistent children. Instead, she heard Isaac answering every question with the same earnest attention he would have given an adult, explaining why the posts had to be set deep, why cedar lasted longer than pine in this soil, why the wire had to be tight but not too tight. His voice carried across the yard in the cool air, low and even, and Millie's voice rose and fell around it like a small bright bird around a steadier one. By noon the 3 posts were done, and Peter had gone back to town with the wagon, and Louise called them in for dinner. The kitchen was warm from the stove and smelled of beans and biscuits and coffee, and Isaac took off his hat and his coat at the door and washed his hands at the basin without being asked. He sat down at the table and waited until Louise and Millie were seated before he touched his food, which was also noticed and also filed away. "You've done real work before," Louise said, and it came out more bluntly than a compliment usually does. "My family had a farm in Kentucky," Isaac said. "I've been in Texas 3 years now, working other men's land mostly. The Harmon place is my first stake of my own." "Kentucky is a long way," Louise said. "Yes, it is," he said, and he looked at his coffee cup when he said it, which told her there was a longer story there that he was not offering to tell, and that she would not ask after. They ate in companionable near silence, with Millie filling the gaps in conversation with a detailed account of something her friend Clara from the Parson farm had done with a frog that apparently required significant narrative investment. Isaac listened to the frog story with the same focused attention he had given the fence post questions, laughing at the right moment, asking a clarifying question at another, and Louise watched him while pretending to attend to her biscuit and felt the settled, self-contained world she had built shifting slightly on its foundations in a way she did not know what to do with. He thanked her for dinner with the plainness of a man who meant it and left before mid-afternoon, and that was that. Louise told herself it had been a simple neighborly transaction, and it was done. She was right about the transaction. She was less right about the done. Over the following weeks, the small exchanges of neighboring life brought them into contact with a regularity that Louise had not anticipated, because the nature of adjacent land is that its problems often have shared solutions. Isaac's north fence bordered the creek, and when the water level dropped in October, he came to ask if she had noticed changes upstream that might explain it, because there was a beaver dam situation that affected them both. Louise knew about the dam. They took their horses up along the creek one morning to assess it, with Millie riding doubled up behind her mother on Copper, and the beaver dam turned out to be an impressively engineered piece of work that had redirected a channel with real consequence for both properties. "We need to redirect it rather than destroy it," Louise said, studying the dam with the pragmatic consideration she applied to most things. "If we just break it, the flood when it releases will take out both our banks." Isaac looked at her with an expression that was the particular look of someone who has just revised their estimation of a person upward. "That's exactly right," he said. "I was thinking a channel here." He indicated a line with his hand that would let them keep their dam but redirect the main flow back to the original bed. "That would take a day," Louise said. "Two, probably," he said. "Would you work on it with me?" She looked at the dam. She looked at the creek. She looked at the live oaks dropping their small leaves into the water like a slow, ongoing decision. "Saturday," she said. On Saturday they worked along the creek for most of the day, Millie entertaining herself on the bank with the single-minded dedication of a child who has discovered that mud can be made into a variety of shapes, and Louise and Isaac worked with shovels and moved rocks and argued mildly about the angle of the channel, and then did not argue about it but discussed it, which is a different thing entirely. By late afternoon, the channel was cut, and the water was moving where they wanted it to move, and Louise stood ankle-deep in the creek watching it, and feeling the particular satisfaction of having fixed a complicated problem with her own hands. "You're good at this," Isaac said. He was standing beside her in the water, his boots in his hand, his trousers rolled to the knee. "I've had to be," Louise said. There was a pause. The creek moved around their feet with a cheerful indifference to human complication. "Millie told me about your husband," he said. He said it directly but gently, the way you say a thing that deserves to be said with care. "She talks about him." "She does," Louise said. "She was very small when he died, but she carries him around with her in a way I'm glad of." "I'm sorry," Isaac said. "It was 3 years ago," Louise said, which was not the same as saying it was all right, and he seemed to understand the distinction, because he did not follow it with the usual reassurances that people often felt obligated to provide. They stood in the creek a moment longer and then went to collect Millie, who had constructed something that she described as a palace, and that looked, in the way of all great childhood architectural achievements, like a mound of mud with optimistic additions. The evenings had grown longer in their cold, and the stars over Texas in October were extravagant in the way that reminded a person, whether they wanted reminding or not, that the universe was very large and human troubles, while real and significant, were not the central organizing fact of existence. Louise sat on her porch some evenings after Millie was in bed and looked at those stars and allowed herself, carefully, to think about Isaac Fletcher. She was not a fool. She knew what it felt like to begin to care for someone. She had cared for Daniel that way, had known from early on in their acquaintance that he was someone who mattered to her in a way that would continue to matter, and the knowledge had been both simple and terrifying. What she felt now was different in character from what she had felt for Daniel, not lesser, but different in the way that rivers are different even when they are running toward the same sea. Isaac was more complicated than Daniel, or perhaps she was more complicated now than she had been then, and the feeling had a wariness in it that Daniel had never produced, a guardedness that she recognized as the product of loss. She told herself that she was being sensible. She told herself that a widow with a 5-year-old and 40 acres, and barely enough to get by, had no business entertaining feelings for a neighbor she had known 5 weeks who might not feel anything of the kind in return, and who might leave, the way people left, the way Daniel had left by dying, and the way the world had demonstrated its unreliability in a dozen smaller ways since. She had made her peace with struggling alone. That was what she told herself. She had looked the struggle in the face and named it and accepted it, and she had built her life around that acceptance, and she was fine. She was getting along. She did not need to open herself to the particular kind of grief that comes from wanting something and not getting it, or from getting it and then losing it. She was still telling herself this in November when Isaac came to her door on a Tuesday evening after dinner with a piece of paper in his hand and an expression she could not read. "I need to talk to you about something," he said. Louise stepped out onto the porch rather than inviting him in, because Millie was nearly asleep, and also because she was not sure she was ready for him to be in her kitchen in the evening, which was a different and more intimate geography than her kitchen at noon. "All right," she said. He showed her the paper. It was a notice from the Cattlemen's Bank of San Antonio, and it was addressed to her, and she had already received her own copy 3 days ago and had looked at it and put it in the drawer in the kitchen table and not looked at it again because looking at it again had not produced any solutions. "They're calling in a portion of the mortgage," Isaac said. "Early payment clause." "I know," Louise said. "Do you have it?" She looked at him in the thin November dark. "No," she said, and it cost her something to say it. "I have most of it, not all of it." "How much are you short?" "Isaac, how much?" $40, she said. $40 was not a catastrophic amount in some circumstances, and was an entirely catastrophic amount in hers. He reached into his coat and produced his wallet and counted out the money and held it toward her, and Louise looked at it the way she might have looked at something that was simultaneously a solution and a threat. "No," she said. "Louise." "No," she said again, and her voice had the particular quality it got when she had made a final decision. "I do not take charity and I do not take loans I cannot repay on terms I cannot guarantee. I will find another way." "What other way?" he said, and it was not unkind, but it was direct. "That is my problem to solve," she said. He stood on her porch in the dark and looked at her with those complicated eyes, and she could see him making calculations of his own, measuring approach, deciding on angle. "I know you can solve your own problems," he said at length. "I've watched you do it for 6 weeks. You're the most capable woman I've ever met and probably the most capable person, and I'm not offering you this money because I think you can't manage without it. I'm offering it because I can and because—" He stopped. "Because what?" Louise said. The pause was long enough to have weather in it. "Because I would like very much to see you keep this land," he said. "Because this land suits you and you suit it, and that's worth something to me." Louise looked at the money in his hand. She looked at him. The night was very cold and the stars were doing their extravagant thing, and somewhere in the house she could hear Millie's small, steady breathing. "I can't take your money," she said, "but I thank you for the offer, and I mean that." He nodded once, put the money away. "All right," he said, "but I want you to think about something." "What?" "I'm going to be taking my cattle to the market in San Antonio in 3 weeks," he said. "I've been asking around about what the bank will take for early settlement of a combined mortgage obligation. There may be options that aren't obvious from inside a single holding." She stared at him. "You're talking about a combined mortgage." "I'm talking about the possibility of it," he said carefully. "I'm not asking you anything tonight. I'm asking you to think." He left after that, and Louise stood on the cold porch for a long time after his lantern had disappeared into the dark of the draw, and she thought about it in the way she thought about things she did not want to think about, which was thoroughly and against her will. She had made her peace with struggling alone. She had. She had made that peace, and sealed it with 3 years of evidence that she could do it, and with Daniel's grave on the hill behind the barn, and with the knowledge that love, which was the most beautiful thing she had encountered in her 31 years on earth, was also the most catastrophic in its endings. But the peace she had made was not quite as comfortable as she had been telling herself it was. She took Millie to the Parson place the following Saturday and rode into town alone and went to the bank and talked to the manager, a thin, precise man named Collins who wore spectacles and had the manner of someone who had decided efficiency was a substitute for kindness. She asked him questions about combined mortgage obligations and early settlement terms, and Collins told her several things she had not known before, including that the bank would, under certain conditions, offer more favorable terms to consolidated holdings above a certain acreage threshold, and that 80 acres fell just above that threshold where 40 acres fell below it. She rode home thinking about 40 acres and 40 acres, and how they were, in purely mathematical terms, 80. She was still thinking about it when she came around the bend by the live oaks and found Isaac sitting on his horse at the edge of the draw, waiting, the way a man waits when he has decided to wait and has not set a time limit on it. "Were you at the bank?" he said. "That is not your business," she said, and then immediately, "Yes." He nodded. He was looking at her with a careful steadiness. "What did Collins tell you?" she told him. "All of it, including the threshold." When she finished, there was a silence that was full of the thing neither of them had said yet. "I am not a woman who makes decisions in 3 weeks," Louise said finally. "About land, about money, about anything." "I know that," Isaac said. "I'm not sure you do," she said. "I want to be very clear that I am not someone who will be swept along on someone else's timeline because it's convenient for their plans." "I'm not trying to sweep you along anywhere," he said. He was very still on his horse. The afternoon light was coming through the live oaks in long gold pieces, and it fell across him in a way that was entirely unfair. "I am asking you to consider something. That's all. The considering is yours." She looked at him for a long moment. "I'll consider it," she said, "but I want you to understand something first." "Tell me," he said. "I have worked very hard to be all right on my own," she said. "I have worked harder than most people know. And I have told myself for 3 years that I have made my peace with this life, exactly as it is, and that the peace is enough. And most of the time I believe it." She paused. "But if I am going to consider what you're suggesting, I need you to understand that I am not going to enter into any arrangement, as a lesser party. I will not be a woman who trades her independence for security. If there is to be anything between us, it will be between equals." The words came out with the force of something that had been building for a long time, and they surprised her in their completeness, because she had not known until she said them exactly how fully she had formed them. Isaac looked at her. His expression had changed into something she had not seen on him before, something that was very still and very earnest and rather careful. "Louise," he said, "I have no interest in a lesser party. I am a man who would consider himself very fortunate to be the equal of Louise Bancroft." She looked at him for another moment, and then turned her horse toward home without another word, and she rode back across her land in the cold golden afternoon, and felt the world shifting again on those foundations she had thought were settled. The weeks that followed were a kind of negotiation that was not entirely about land. They talked. They talked about the practicalities first because that was easier, and because both of them were the kind of people who dealt with the concrete before the abstract. They talked about fence lines and water rights, and which acreage would serve better for the additional cattle Isaac was planning to bring in the spring. They talked to Collins at the bank together one morning in late November, and Collins showed them figures and terms that were significantly more favorable than what either of them held alone. And Louise spent a long evening at her kitchen table with a pencil and paper, and did the mathematics until they made sense to her. She also talked to the Parson woman, Ellen Parson, who was perhaps the closest thing Louise had to a friend in Redemption Creek, a broad-shouldered, plain-spoken woman from Ohio who had a way of looking at things that Louise found useful. Louise told her about Isaac and the land and the mortgage, and she watched Ellen Parson try to organize her expression into something neutral and fail slightly. "He sounds like a good man," Ellen said carefully. "He is," Louise said. "That's not the question." "What is the question?" Louise looked at her coffee. "Whether I am capable of wanting something again." Ellen put her hand on Louise's. It was a brief gesture, not sentimental, entirely serious. "I think the fact that you're asking that question means you already know the answer," she said. Louise said nothing. "Daniel was a good man," Ellen said. "He would not have wanted the land to struggle and Millie to grow up watching you carry everything alone if there was a man worth trusting who could stand beside you." "I know what Daniel would have wanted," Louise said quietly. "That is not the difficulty. The difficulty is what I want." "And what do you want?" The kitchen was warm. Through the window the Parson land stretched out in the pale winter light, stubbled and quiet. Louise thought about what she wanted, which was something she had very carefully avoided thinking about in full for 3 years, and found that the answer was larger and more inconveniently specific than she had expected. "I want the land to be safe," she said. "I want Millie to have enough. She stopped and started again. "I want to not have to carry all of it alone every single day." "Then don't," Ellen said. It was not advice exactly. It was more like permission, and Louise had not known until that moment how much she had needed permission from someone who understood the cost. She went home from the Parson place and found Isaac at her south fence again, not fixing anything this time, just looking at the line of it where it ran along the ridge, and she walked up beside him and stood there, and he did not speak, and neither did she for a moment. "I have been telling myself I have made my peace with struggling alone," she said. 3 years I have told myself that, and I have believed it most of the time." He turned to look at her. He was very still in the way he got when something mattered. "And," he said, "and I think I should like to be argued out of it," she said, and for the first time in a long time she felt something very close to terrified and also something very close to alive. Isaac looked at her and something shifted in his face, something careful and held back loosening, and he said, "I have come to dispute that." He said it simply, as if it were something he had been thinking about for a while and was glad to finally say, and Louise looked at him in the cold December morning with her breath making small clouds in the air between them and felt something inside her that had been locked for 3 years turn like a key. "Then start disputing," she said. He did not reach for her then. He was not that kind of man, and she was not that kind of situation, and the beginning of what they were to each other was made in words and work, and the slow accumulation of 1,000 small moments rather than in any single dramatic gesture. He talked to her that morning about the spring, about what the combined land could be, about a plan for the cattle that was practical and considered, and that he had clearly been working out in his head for some time. And he talked about Millie in a way that was not about winning Louise's approval, but about genuine regard. And he talked about Kentucky, only a little but enough for her to understand that his reasons for being in Texas were also about starting over after something had ended, though his ending was a different shape from hers. They walked the fence line together, both of them, the length of the south boundary and around to the draw and up along the creek. And by the time they came back to the house, Millie had woken up and was standing on the porch in her coat looking for her mother. And when she saw them coming, she ran toward them with the unguarded velocity that children run with when they have not yet learned to protect themselves from disappointment. And she arrived at Isaac with her arms open, and he caught her and swung her up in the way that had become natural between them over the months. And Louise watched this and felt something settle in her chest like a bird landing on a branch, something that had been wheeling around for a long time finally finding its place. December came in cold and honest. The work of 2 neighboring properties joining their effort in all but name was substantial, and there was no shortage of practical things to focus on, which Louise appreciated because practical things were a language she trusted. They mended a significant section of shared fence. They organized the shared water arrangement from the creek into something more formal, with a simple written document that Louise had insisted on, and that Isaac had agreed to immediately, because he understood that her insistence on documentation was not distrust of him personally, but the hard-won habit of a woman who had learned that gentlemen's agreements, however well-intentioned, did not hold up in courts of law. He was at her place most days. Sometimes he came for a specific purpose, a task, a question, a borrowed tool returned. Sometimes Millie went to his place with him while Louise caught up on mending or accounting, and came back in the evening with complicated accounts of what his dog, a 3-legged hound he had acquired from a man passing through town, had gotten into. The dog was named Justice, which Millie found extremely funny for reasons she was unable to articulate. On Christmas Eve, the Parson family hosted a gathering that included most of the families within a reasonable distance of Redemption Creek, and Louise came with Millie and Isaac came alone, and they spent the evening near each other with the particular nearness of people who have not formally defined what they are but have stopped pretending they don't know. Ellen Parson watched all of this with the calm satisfaction of someone watching a complicated thing come together correctly. There was music. A man named Roy Delacroix had a fiddle and played it with the cheerful, aggressive competence of someone who had played the same songs for 40 years and was not interested in expanding his repertoire. And the parlor floor cleared for dancing in the way that parlor floors at Christmas parties did. And Isaac stood beside Louise and asked with a look rather than words whether she wanted to dance. And she did, and they did. And Millie danced between them with the unself-conscious joy of a 5-year-old at a party past her bedtime. It was while they were dancing, somewhere in the middle of the third reel, that Isaac said quietly close to her ear, "I want to ask you something." "Then ask it," she said. "Not here," he said. "When you're ready to hear it." She pulled back enough to look at his face. He was looking at her with an expression that made her heart do the particular thing it had been doing with increasing frequency in recent weeks, the thing she had stopped trying to reason it out of. "I am not a woman who likes to wait for things," she said. "I know," he said, "but this is not a thing to be asked at a Christmas party in the Parson parlor." She considered this. "Tomorrow then," she said. "Tomorrow," he agreed. She did not sleep very well that night, which was not entirely about not knowing what the question was going to be, since she suspected she knew what the question was going to be, and was therefore occupied with the much more complex business of deciding what the answer was going to be. She had been through the decision in her head many times over the preceding months, approaching it from different angles the way you circle a piece of land you are considering buying, looking at it in different lights, testing the soil, checking the water. She had looked at it from the angle of practicality and found that the case for the thing was strong. She had looked at it from the angle of Millie and found that the case was perhaps even stronger. She had looked at it from the angle of her own heart, which was the most frightening angle, and found that the case from that direction was the strongest of all, and also the most painful, because what her heart had to say about Isaac Fletcher was no longer a mild interest or a comfortable neighborly regard, but something much larger and less manageable, something that was in the same family as terror and joy and the recognition of the irreversible. She had made her peace with struggling alone. He had come to dispute it. He had disputed it thoroughly, patiently, without drama or pressure, by being exactly who he was, and she had found that she did not have very good arguments left. Christmas morning was cold and clear, and she woke Millie early and they opened the small gifts she had put together, a new doll with a cloth face, a warm pair of stockings, an orange that Millie treated as the most extravagant luxury, which it nearly was. They had breakfast and Millie played, and at mid-morning Louise heard his horse in the yard. She went to the door before he knocked. He was standing on her porch with his hat in his hands, and he looked as close to nervous as she had ever seen him, which was not very close because he was a man who held things internally, but it was there, and she recognized it with something that was entirely tender. "Merry Christmas," she said. "Merry Christmas," he said. He looked past her into the house. "Millie's up. She's occupied." He nodded. He turned his hat in his hands once. "Louise," he said. "Isaac," she said. He looked at her directly, the way he always did, with those complicated eyes that were more green than brown in the winter light. "I am going to say something that I have been thinking about for several months," he said, "and I want you to let me finish it before you say anything, because if you speak before I'm done I may lose the thread of it." "All right," she said. "I came to Texas to start over," he said. "I had a life in Kentucky that ended, and I came out here because the land was cheap and the sky was big, and I thought that starting over required a place where there was no history, nothing familiar. I bought the Harmon place because it was available and the price was right, and I thought I would work the land alone and build something, and that would be enough." He paused. "And then I met you." He stopped. She did not speak as promised. "You are the most remarkable woman I have ever known," he said, "and I use that word in the old sense, the sense of something that inspires wonder, because you do. You have built something here with your own hands and your own will out of grief and hard circumstance, and you have done it without asking for help even when help would have been right. And you have raised a child who is, Millie is something, Louise. She is genuinely something, and that is all you. He took a breath. I am not asking you because of the land or the mortgage or any practical consideration, though those things are real. I am asking you because I am in love with you, and I believe I have been since approximately the second week of October when you told me that my fence wire was holding by faith more than physics, which is the best thing I have heard anyone say. She felt the laugh start before she could stop it, a real laugh, surprised out of her. I am asking you to marry me, he said. Not as a transaction and not as a rescue, because you don't need rescuing, and anyone who offers to rescue Louise Bancroft is a fool. I am asking as one person who wants to stand beside another person for the rest of the time there is, if you'll have me. The morning was very quiet around his words. Somewhere inside the house Millie was singing something to her new doll, small and tuneless and entirely happy. Louise looked at Isaac Fletcher on her Christmas porch and saw him plainly, the man he had shown himself to be in 4 months of being exactly himself without performance or pretense, a man who fixed fence posts and answered a child's questions about beavers, and stood at a creek in October with his boots off, and negotiated with bankers without trying to do it for her, and had come to dispute her peace with struggling alone, and had done it by being steady and present and true. I am afraid, she said, because it was true and he deserved the truth. I know, he said, so am I. I am afraid that things end, she said. I am afraid of what it costs to want something and then not have it. Yes, he said, that fear is rational and I have it too. She looked at him. But you're asking anyway. I am asking anyway, he said, because I think not asking would cost more. She was quiet for a moment. The cold air moved around them. The sky over the Texas hill country was a perfect winter blue, the kind of blue that seems too committed to be real. Yes, she said. It was a very simple word, and she said it plainly, without drama, the way she said most things. And his face changed in a way that she would remember for the rest of her life. Something behind it opening, something careful and long-held releasing. He stepped forward and took her face in his hands the way you hold something that matters enormously, carefully and completely, and he kissed her. And it was the kind of kiss that is also a conversation, that says things that words have been circling around for months. When Millie appeared at the door half a moment later with her doll under her arm, she regarded them with the calm assessment of a 5-year-old who has been following the situation. Are you going to live here now? She said to Isaac. Eventually, he said very seriously. Good, she said, and went back inside. They were married in February of 1879, on a day when the Texas sky was gray with the possibility of rain, and the creek was running high and the live oaks were still bare, and the ceremony was held in the church with the leaky roof, which did not leak that day, which everyone took as a favorable sign. Ellen Parsons stood up for Louise, and Roy Delacroix brought his fiddle to the gathering afterward, and Millie wore a dress Louise had made from the calico she had bought at Harold Pitt's store in October, and danced with every person at the party who would dance with her, which was everyone. Isaac had told Louise the story of Kentucky before they married, because she had asked, and because she believed in the importance of telling and the importance of knowing, and his story was this. He had been engaged to a woman named Clara who had died in a sickness that took several people from his town in the same winter, and he had left because the grief and the place had become inseparable in his mind, and he had needed to go somewhere that had not known him before the loss. He told it quietly and plainly, and Louise held his hands while he told it and understood the shape of the grief, because she had lived the shape of grief, and knew how it is to carry a person inside you who is no longer there to be held. She would have liked Texas, he said at the end. She would have needed to, Louise said, which made him smile in the way he smiled when she said things that were unexpected. They were good together in the way that well-matched things are good, not perfectly smooth or without friction. Louise had strong opinions and an independent nature that did not simply dissolve into partnership, and Isaac had a stubbornness that he was better at disguising than she was, but fundamentally aligned in the things that matter, in their approach to work and honesty, and the raising of children, and the treatment of land and the measurement of what a life should be. The combined property was 82 acres when they settled the new arrangement with the bank in March, and Collins presented them with updated documentation and a rate that made the mathematics of the next several years substantially more manageable. Isaac's cattle run in the spring brought back money that covered the last of the outstanding mortgage balance and left enough over to fix the barn roof properly for the first time in 3 years. And Louise stood in the yard watching Isaac and Peter and another man from town called Eli working on the roof, and felt something in her chest that was quiet and warm and enormous, and was happiness, plainly and without qualification. Millie, who had adopted Isaac with the complete and uncomplicated loyalty of a child who has decided a thing, had started calling him Papa by April, first tentatively, and then with the confident frequency of someone who has found that a new word fits exactly right. Isaac received this with a stillness that Louise recognized as the emotional equivalent of something very large and very carefully not spilled. One evening in May he came to her while she was sitting on the porch after Millie was in bed and sat beside her and said nothing for a while, in the manner of a man working up to something. "She called me Papa 3 times at dinner," he said. "I know," Louise said. How do you feel about that?" Louise looked at the Texas evening, at the way the light was going out of it in layers of pink and gold and finally a dark blue that was almost black. "Daniel is her father," she said, "and always will be. She knows that, but she needed someone to be Papa, and I think she has decided that is you." She looked at him. "If that's all right with you." He looked at her for a moment and then looked away, and in the gathering dark she could see him working to keep his expression from doing the thing it was doing. "It is more than all right," he said. "It is." He stopped, started again. "I did not expect this," he said. "This life. I did not expect this to be what I found." "Neither did I," she said quietly. He took her hand in the dark and held it, and they sat on the porch while the stars came out in their extravagant Texas way, and just as the 3-legged hound settled at their feet, and the creek made its steady sound in the distance, and the land lay quiet and theirs around them. By summer Louise knew she was expecting a child, and she told Isaac on a Tuesday morning in June while they were eating breakfast and Millie was feeding the chickens, and she told him directly as she told most things, and watched his face go through several things very quickly before settling into the expression of a man who is profoundly, helplessly happy. "Are you well?" he said. "Are you?" "I am entirely well," she said. "Tired, but well." He stood up from the table and came around it and held her with a kind of careful enormousness, the way people hold things that are important and fragile, and she let herself be held, which she had been practicing more deliberately since February and was getting, she felt, reasonably competent at. "A baby," he said into her hair. "In January, I think," she said. He pulled back and looked at her, and he was smiling in the unguarded way that she rarely saw but loved most, the way he smiled when he was not managing anything, just feeling it. "Louise," he said, and her name in his voice had all 3 years of the preceding story in it, all the fence posts and creek diversions and Christmas parties and mortgage negotiations, and 2-word declarations of love and the whole shape of what they had built, and she felt it all and was not afraid. The summer was hard in the way that Texas summers are hard, relentlessly hot and dry and demanding, and there were problems as there are always problems on working land. A fence that got broken by a spooked cow and needed repairing fast. A section of the creek that threatened to redirect itself again after a July storm. A dispute with a neighboring property 3 miles to the west over grazing rights that required a visit to the county seat. And a lawyer named Abernathy, who had the world-weary demeanor of a man who had heard all possible arguments and been persuaded by very few of them, but who ultimately found in their favor. Louise handled the dispute negotiation largely herself, much to Abernathy's visible surprise and to Isaac's visible satisfaction, and they came back from the county seat on a hot August evening with the paperwork settled and ate dinner on the porch because the kitchen was too warm, and watched the lightning on the horizon over Mexico that meant rain was coming eventually but not tonight. "You were magnificent with Abernathy," Isaac said. "He was reluctant to take me seriously," Louise said. "He came around. He always would have," she said. "Men like Abernathy are not bad men, they just have expectations that require updating." Isaac smiled at her. "I should get you a law degree," he said. "The Bar Association would need updating first," she said. Autumn came again, the second autumn of their life together, and it was better than the first in every quantifiable way. The cattle were healthy and the fence was sound, and the water rights were established, and the barn roof did not leak, and Millie started her lessons with the schoolteacher who had come to Redemption Creek in the fall, a young woman from Boston named Miss Hartley, who was either heroically brave or entirely unaware of what she had agreed to when she signed on to teach in a Texas hill country town, and whom Millie adored with the intense focus of a child who has found a new subject of interest. In October, Louise and Isaac rode up along the creek on a Sunday afternoon, just the two of them, because Millie was at the Parson place playing with the Parson children, and they went past the Beaver Dam, which had maintained the channel they had redirected and appeared to have accepted the arrangement as permanent, and up to the ridge that looked out over both their properties, all 82 acres of it running out to the south and east in the afternoon light. "This was your idea," Isaac said. They were looking out at the land. "It was the only sensible mathematics," she said. He reached over from his horse and took her hand. "I'm not talking about the mortgage." She looked at the land. She looked at the sky. She looked at him, her husband, this man who had come to dispute her peace with struggling alone and had been so thoroughly right to do it, who had known before she did that the peace she had made was a lesser thing than what she was capable of, that the life she had built, as strong and admirable as it was, had been missing the particular thing that it was missing, and had simply and persistently shown up until she could see it too. "I know," she said. The baby was born in January, which was when Louise had calculated, on a night when the temperature dropped sharply and the stars were so bright they seemed to have opinions about things. Isaac was there the whole time, which was not the custom exactly, but Louise had looked at him when the time began and said, "You can go to the barn if you prefer." And he had said, "I prefer to stay," with the directness of a man who has made up his mind, and so he stayed. Ellen Parson served as midwife, competent and calm, and Millie slept through most of it in the room she shared with Justice, who had decided that the activity in the main part of the house was worth sleeping through. The baby was a boy. Isaac held him in the first minutes with the careful enormousness of someone holding the most important thing he has ever held, and the baby had Louise's coloring and Isaac's hands, and a disposition that seemed, from the first hours, to be fundamentally interested in everything, which seemed exactly right. They named him Daniel, which was Louise's idea and which she told Isaac about after the birth, sitting up in the bed in the gray dawn with the baby asleep, and Isaac in the chair beside her with the exhausted, luminous look of a man who has just witnessed something that has reorganized his understanding of existence. "Daniel," Isaac said. He looked at the baby. He looked at Louise. "Are you sure? He deserves to be remembered," Louise said, "and this is a life that wouldn't exist without everything that came before it. I don't want to pretend the before part didn't happen." Isaac looked at her with an expression that was too full for a simple name. He reached out and touched her face with the same gentleness as the Christmas morning when he had first kissed her. "Daniel Fletcher," he said, trying it out. "Daniel Fletcher," she confirmed. Millie met her brother in the morning with the same decisive, immediate investment she had applied to everything that mattered to her, examined him thoroughly, reported that he was very small and also very pink, and announced that she intended to teach him everything important. Isaac told her that was an excellent plan. Louise told her to start with patience, which she said she would do as soon as she figured out what patience was. The winter was cold, but the house was warm with the fire, and the new stove Isaac had bought in the fall, and the particular warmth of a full house. And Louise sat by the fire in the evenings nursing Daniel, while Millie read aloud from the primer Miss Hartley had sent home with her. And Isaac mended harness or reviewed the accounts or read. And Justice slept by the hearth with the profound devotion of an animal who has recognized a good situation and has no intention of moving. And the ranch outside, the windows was quiet in the Texas winter, with the creek running low and the cattle in the lower pasture, and the live oaks silver in the moonlight. Spring of 1880 brought the rains that Texas had been withholding, and the grass came back with a force that felt like argument, green and insistent, covering the copper-colored rock and the dry slopes with something that looked, for a few weeks every year, like Ireland. Louise planted her kitchen garden with the seriousness she applied to everything, and Daniel slept in a basket in the garden shade while she worked, and Isaac expanded the pasture fence to accommodate the additional cattle he was planning to bring up from San Antonio in April. And Millie informed the family at dinner one evening that she intended to be a lawyer or possibly a judge, which she had learned about from Miss Hartley, and that she would need everyone's cooperation in this endeavor. "Whatever you intend to be," Louise told her, "you will need mathematics. Pay attention to the mathematics." "Miss Hartley says I'm already good at mathematics," Millie said. "Then you're ahead," Isaac said. "I know," Millie agreed. He caught Louise's eye over Millie's head, and they shared the look of parents who have done something very right, which is also a kind of love, the love that comes from building a life together and watching what grows in it. In the summer of that year, when Daniel was 6 months old and sitting up and practicing being interested in everything with exhausting thoroughness, Louise and Isaac sat on the porch in the long Texas evening after the children were in bed, and she thought about the woman she had been 2 years before, standing at a fence post in the October cold, telling a man she didn't know that the fence was hers, "Thank you." She had been strong. She had been capable. She had gotten by, which was more than many people managed, and she had done it on her own, and that had been real, and she did not want to diminish it by saying she had simply been waiting for a man to come along. She had not been waiting. She had been living, genuinely and fully, and the life she had built alone had been a real life with real value. But Isaac had been right about one thing, and she knew it now in the full warmth of the evening with the smell of the grass, and the sound of the creek, and the particular quietness of a house with sleeping children in it. The peace she had made with struggling alone had been a kind of armor. It had protected her from the cost of wanting things she might not get, and it had also protected her from the cost of wanting things she might get, which is a different and larger risk, because getting the thing means you now have something to lose, and the territory of loving something is always also the territory of the fear of losing it. She had known this, and she had chosen it anyway, and she chose it again every day, and that was not weakness or compromise. It was simply the most courageous thing she had ever done, larger in its way than 3 years of managing 40 acres alone, which had been the courage of self-sufficiency. This was the courage of openness, the courage of saying yes to the world when you know what the world can take from you. Isaac was watching the stars, and she watched him watching them. "What are you thinking?" she said. He looked at her. "I'm thinking about the fence," he said. "Which one?" "The first one," he said. "The one I fixed in October." "3 posts," she said. "3 posts," he said. "I came over to tell you about 3 fence posts, and I have never recovered from it." She laughed, a real laugh, the kind she had been giving more freely in the last year, that surprised herself with its ease. "That is a terrible way to tell a love story," she said. "It's the truest way I know," he said. He looked at her with the same straightforward earnestness he had brought to every difficult thing he had said to her, the same directness that had been the first thing she had trusted about him. 3 fence posts, and then everything. "And then everything," she agreed. He reached across the space between them, and she took his hand, and they sat in the summer dark with the Texas night surrounding them, vast and indifferent in the way that large things are indifferent and beautiful in the same way. And their land lay out around the house in the dark, the land that was hers and his and theirs. 82 acres and a creek and a beaver dam, and a stand of live oaks that turned gold in October, and a grave on the hill behind the barn that she still visited and would always visit. And that was part of the story too, fully and honestly part of it. Daniel grew. He was a loud, cheerful, determined baby who became a loud, cheerful, determined toddler who followed his father around the property with a seriousness that suggested he was taking notes. Millie taught him everything she considered important, beginning with the names of all the animals and moving steadily toward more advanced subjects. Justice, the three-legged hound, accepted Daniel's pulling and grabbing with the patience of an animal who has decided that some things are simply the weather, and Daniel learned by his first birthday to move across the floor with great speed, which caused a reorganization of the lower shelves of every cupboard in the house. Christmas of 1880 was the fullest they had known. With the house genuinely crowded for the first time, Ellen Parson and her family came for dinner on Christmas Day, and Roy Delacroix came in the evening with his fiddle. And the parlor was warm and loud, and full of children in various states of exhaustion and festivity. Louise stood in her kitchen doorway and watched it all, the noise and the warmth and the light and the people, and felt the fullness of it with a clarity that was sometimes frightening in its sheer scale. Isaac found her there, as he found her in most doorways where she stood and thought, with a quietness that she was convinced was his particular gift, the ability to arrive beside her without disturbing whatever she was doing. "All right," he said quietly under the noise. "More than," she said. He stood beside her in the doorway and looked at the room with her. Millie was playing cards with two of the Parson children at the table, and winning, from the look of it, with the composed confidence of someone who has studied the mathematics. Daniel was asleep in Ellen Parson's arms, entirely undisturbed by the fiddle and the conversation, having apparently decided that loud rooms were the natural state of existence. Roy Delacroix was mid-song, something cheerful in 3/4 time that had two of the Parson children dancing in the middle of the floor. "I want to tell you something," Louise said. "Tell me," he said. "I am glad," she said. "For the record and without reservation, I am glad you came to dispute it." He was quiet for a moment. In the warm light of the parlor she could see the side of his face and the small smile that started in the corner of it. "For the record," he said, "it was the best argument I have ever made." She leaned against his shoulder, which was a thing she had learned to do, and which she did without analysis now, with the ease of something that has become natural, and he put his arm around her, and they stood in the doorway of their house on Christmas evening in 1880 and watched the life they had made together fill the rooms with noise and warmth and people who mattered. And the night outside the windows was cold and bright with stars, and the land was quiet. And there were cattle in the lower pasture and horses in the barn, and a three-legged hound somewhere in the vicinity of the children's table hoping for handouts, and everything that mattered was here, present and accounted for, resolved into the particular wholeness of a life that has been built deliberately and honestly, and with open hands. The spring of 1881 brought news that the Cattlemen's Bank of San Antonio was offering extended favorable terms to consolidated properties in the Hill Country District, the result of a policy change that Collins delivered with the expression of a man who has been persuaded by facts rather than sentiment. And Louise and Isaac signed the new arrangement with the comfortable ease of people who have been doing their own legal reading and are not surprised by fine print. The ranch was in the black for the first time, properly in the black, with enough set aside for the season and enough over for improvement, and a small amount left that Louise put in a separate account at the bank with Millie's name on it, which she explained to Millie as the beginning of what you will build. Millie accepted this with the gravity appropriate to the beginning of a building project and asked what she needed to do to add to it. Louise told her. She told her about work and saving, and the difference between what you need and what you want and how to tell them apart. And Millie listened with the focused attention she gave to everything she took seriously, which was most things. That summer, on a Saturday when the heat shimmered off the rock and the creek had narrowed to its august patience, and the air smelled of cedar and dry grass, and the particular warm dust of Texas in July, Louise rode up alone to the hill behind the barn, to Daniel's grave, which she had kept as she always kept it, with a simple stone and whatever was growing wild nearby. She sat beside it for a while in the way she had learned to sit beside grief, not fighting it and not drowning in it, but allowing it its proper size, which was real but not larger than the life around it. "We're all right," she said, because she always spoke to him when she came, and it was not a performance, and it was not madness, and it was simply the continuation of a conversation she had never been able to finish. "Millie is something remarkable. You would see yourself in her, and you would be right to. And there is a boy named Daniel who has your hands." She paused. "I'm not struggling alone," she said. "I know you would not have wanted me to." The hill was quiet. The cedar smelled sharp and clean. Below, she could see the house and the barn and the pasture, and the figure of Isaac in the field doing something with the fence, which was always being done with, and the smaller figure of Millie running toward him from the house. And even from this distance, she could see him turn and open his arms for the running child with the naturalness of someone for whom this is the most ordinary gesture in the world, which is what it had become. She rode back down the hill and across the yard and swung down from Copper, who was getting genuinely old now but who had decided, apparently, that dying was not a priority, and walked to the fence where Isaac was working. He looked up and saw her face, and he had always been able to read her face, which she had initially found alarming and had come to find something she was profoundly grateful for. "You went up to the hill," he said. "I did," she said. He put down the wire and came around the fence and stood in front of her. He did not ask if she was all right in the anxious way. He simply looked at her with the full attention that was his particular gift. "I told him we're all right," she said. "Are we?" he said. She looked at him, at the land behind him, at the house, at the sky. "We are entirely all right," she said. "We are more than all right." He nodded. He reached out and took her hand in both of his. They stood at the fence in the July heat for a moment, both of them quiet with it, the fullness of all that had led here and all that was here and all that was still to come. And then Millie arrived at full speed from the direction of the house, and inserted herself between them with a detailed account of something Justice had done that morning that required immediate and complete attention. And Isaac listened to the story with his hand still around Louise's, and Louise listened to Millie's voice, clear and bright and entirely itself. And from the direction of the house came the sound of Daniel waking from his nap with the authoritative announcement of a person who feels that sleeping was interesting but is done with it now. Louise looked at Isaac over their daughter's head. He was smiling. She was smiling. The Texas sky was enormous and blue and going on forever in every direction, and the land was theirs and the life was theirs, and she had stopped making peace with struggling alone because she had found, as he had known she would find, that she did not have to, and that the life on the other side of that particular peace was the truest and the most whole thing she had ever known. She went to get Daniel from his nap, walking across the yard in the summer heat, and she could hear behind her Isaac saying something to Millie about the fence that made Millie laugh, and she carried the sound of it inside with her into the cool of the house where her son was waiting, pink-cheeked and ready for the afternoon, and she held him and looked out the window at her husband and her daughter in the field, and she thought with the plainness and completeness that she thought most true things, that this was it. This was the thing. All the rest of it, the struggling and the getting by and the armor and the peace she had made and the dispute of it and the terrifying opening of the door she had thought she had locked, all of it had been the path to this particular, ordinary, extraordinary afternoon. She put her son on her hip and went back outside into the sun. Everything was settled. Everything was whole. The creek ran where they had directed it. The cattle were in the pasture. The fence was sound. The grave on the hill was tended, and the living were here, present and permanent and in love with all of it. And there was work tomorrow, and the day after, and the season to get through, and more Christmases coming, and more calico, and more mortgage reviews with Collins, and more late evenings on the porch, and more mornings before dawn, and more fence posts, and the whole long, good, hard, ordinary life of it stretching out ahead of them under the same extravagant Texas sky, which would go on being enormous and indifferent and beautiful regardless, and which tonight would put up a sunset that nobody in Redemption Creek would be able to pretend was just weather, and under which Louise Bancroft Fletcher would stand on her porch with her husband's arm around her and her children near and her land all around her and feel, without reservation, without armor, without the careful management of what she allowed herself to want, the full and finally unrestricted weight of a life that was hers and had always been capable of this, and had been waiting only for her to let it be.